Catherine Monroe had never run so fast in her entire life. The white silk of her wedding dress caught on branches and thorns as she plunged through the darkness of the Philadelphia countryside. Behind her, the grand estate blazed with light and confusion. Voices shouted her name. Dogs barked. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not after what she had discovered just hours before her wedding ceremony was set to begin. The morning had started like any bride's dream. Servants bustled through the mansion, arranging flowers and preparing the grand ballroom. Catherine sat before her vanity mirror while her mother's ladies made pinned delicate orange blossoms into her auburn hair. Everything seemed perfect. She was marrying Harrison Blackwood, the wealthiest railroad tycoon in America. At 23, she would become one of the most powerful women in the country. Her parents couldn't hide their triumph. The Monroe family, though respectable, had been struggling financially for years. This marriage would save them from ruin. But perfection shattered when Catherine overheard a conversation she was never meant to hear. She had been walking past Harrison's study, seeking a moment of quiet before the ceremony, when voices stopped her cold. Harrison was speaking with his business partner, and their words turned her blood to ice. They were discussing a mine collapse in Colorado that had killed 4 to 7 men just 3 weeks earlier. Harrison's voice was casual, almost bored, as he explained how he had bribed officials to keep the story from reaching Eastern newspapers. The safety regulations he had ignored, the corners he had cut to save money, the families he had left destitute without compensation. His partner asked if he felt any guilt. Harrison laughed. He actually laughed. Then he said something that made Catherine's hands shake. He mentioned that his new bride would be useful for securing political connections through her family's old bloodline. She wasn't a person to him. She was a tool. Catherine had backed away from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought of the 4 to 7 men who died in darkness, buried under tons of rock because Harrison Blackwood valued profit over human life. She thought of becoming his wife, his property under the law, forever tied to a man without conscience or soul. The wedding was scheduled to begin in 3 hours. Guests were already arriving. The minister was preparing his sermon. But Catherine knew with absolute certainty that she could not walk down that aisle. She would rather die than pledge her life to a monster. Making her decision took only seconds. Executing it required desperate courage. Catherine slipped into her room and changed from her mourning dress into her wedding gown. If anyone saw her, they would assume she was preparing for the ceremony. She gathered what little she could carry, a small pouch of jewelry she could sell, a warm shawl, and a photograph of her younger sister. Then she waited until the household was distracted with preparations. When the moment came, she simply walked out through the garden door and ran. Now, miles from the estate, Catherine finally slowed her pace. Her lungs burned. Her feet, wrapped in delicate satin slippers, were bleeding. She had no clear plan, no destination. She only knew she needed to get far away before Harrison discovered her absence. And she knew with grim certainty that he would come after her. Men like Harrison Blackwood didn't accept defiance. They didn't tolerate being made to look foolish in front of Philadelphia's elite society. He would hunt her down, not out of love, but out of pride and fury. Catherine reached a crossroads as dawn began to lighten the sky. A weathered sign pointed west toward the frontier territories. East meant returning to everything she knew, to her family and society. But it also meant returning to Harrison's reach. West meant the unknown, danger, and uncertainty. But it also meant freedom. Catherine turned west and kept walking. Behind her, in the growing light, she could hear the distant sound of horses. Harrison had discovered her absence. The hunt had begun. Harrison Blackwood stood in his destroyed study, his face white with rage. Papers were scattered across the floor. A crystal decanter lay shattered against the wall where he had thrown it. His fists clenched and unclenched as he fought to control the fury boiling inside him. Catherine was gone. His bride had vanished 3 hours before their wedding, leaving 300 guests waiting in the ballroom and his reputation in tatters. The humiliation was unbearable. The whispers had already started. People were asking questions. Making assumptions. Some were even smiling behind their hands, enjoying the spectacle of Harrison Blackwood being rejected. His head of security, a former Pinkerton detective named Marcus Walsh, stood nervously by the door. Walsh was a hard man, skilled at intimidation and violence, but even he seemed wary of his employer's current mood. Harrison turned to him with cold eyes. "Find her," he said quietly. "I don't care what it costs or what you have to do. Find Catherine Monroe and bring her back to me." Walsh nodded. "We've got men searching the immediate area. She can't have gotten far on foot. We'll have her back by nightfall." But nightfall came and went without any sign of Catherine. Then another day passed. And another. Walsh's men searched every road, every farm, every small town within 100 miles. They questioned travelers and paid informants. But Catherine seemed to have vanished like smoke. What Harrison didn't know was that his runaway bride had help. A stable boy from the estate, who had once been kind to Catherine, had seen her fleeing. Instead of raising the alarm, he had given her his cousin's address in a town 2 days west. The cousin, a widow who hated wealthy men after her own husband had been cheated by railroad investors, had helped Catherine disguise herself. She cut Catherine's distinctive auburn hair short, dressed her in plain traveling clothes, and arranged passage on a westbound freight wagon. Catherine traveled in the back of wagons, on mail coaches, and sometimes on foot, always moving west. She sold her jewelry piece by piece, just enough to survive. She slept in barns and cheap boarding houses. She kept her head down and spoke to no one unless necessary. But she could feel Harrison's pursuit like a shadow at her back. In every town, she saw wanted posters beginning to appear. The posters claimed she was mentally disturbed, that she had stolen valuable property from the Blackwood estate, that a substantial reward awaited anyone who could return her safely to her family. The lies were printed in bold letters, but Catherine knew their real purpose. Harrison was turning the entire country into his hunting ground. Walsh and his men tracked her across Pennsylvania, into Ohio, and then toward the Mississippi River. They were always a few days behind, but the gap was closing. Walsh was good at his job. He knew how to read people, how to spot lies, how to find the small details others missed. In a boarding house in Illinois, he found a woman who remembered a young lady with short auburn hair and frightened eyes. In Missouri, a wagon driver admitted he had given a ride to someone matching Catherine's description. Each piece of information brought Walsh closer. And Walsh reported everything back to Harrison, who followed behind in a private rail car, living in luxury while his men did the dirty work of hunting. Catherine reached the edge of the true frontier in early autumn. The civilized world of cities and laws was falling away behind her. Ahead lay vast territories where federal authority was thin and survival depended on strength and wit rather than social standing. She had been running for 6 weeks. Her money was nearly gone. Her body was exhausted. But she kept moving because stopping meant capture, and capture meant being dragged back to marry Harrison or worse. She had heard stories of women who defied powerful men. Those stories rarely ended well. In a rough frontier town called Independence, Catherine made a decision that would change everything. She spent her last few dollars on supplies and joined a wagon train heading west toward the Dakota Territory. The wagon master, a grizzled man named Cooper, asked few questions. He needed paying customers, and Catherine's money was as good as anyone's. But Cooper warned her that the journey would be brutal. They would cross hostile territory. Native tribes were fighting to protect their land from the endless flood of white settlers. The army provided some protection, but it was unreliable at best. People died on these journeys. Catherine looked him in the eye and told him she understood the risks. What she didn't say was that she feared Harrison Blackwood far more than any wilderness danger. The wagon train departed at dawn. 23 wagons rolled west, carrying families seeking new lives, merchants seeking profit, and one runaway bride seeking nothing more than freedom. Catherine rode in a supply wagon, keeping to herself, speaking little. The other travelers assumed she was a widow or perhaps a woman fleeing scandal. They respected her privacy. As the wagons creaked across the prairie, Catherine allowed herself to feel a small measure of hope. Perhaps she had finally escaped Harrison's reach. Perhaps out here in the vastness of the frontier, she could disappear completely and start a new life. But 3 days behind them, Marcus Walsh and 5 armed men had picked up her trail again. And this time, Walsh was certain, there would be no escape. The wagon train had been traveling for 18 days when everything went wrong. Catherine had begun to relax slightly. The vast prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, and the small community of travelers had developed a comfortable rhythm. She helped with cooking, mended clothes, and even started making friends with some of the other women. At night, she would sit by the campfire and listen to the men tell stories of the West. For the first time since fleeing Philadelphia, she felt something like peace. She should have known it couldn't last. The attack came at dawn on the 19th day. Catherine was helping prepare breakfast when gunfire erupted from the eastern ridge. But these weren't native warriors defending their land. These were Walsh and his men. They rode into camp with guns drawn, scattering the travelers and sending families diving for cover. Walsh shouted that he was a federal marshal pursuing a dangerous criminal. It was a complete lie, but most of the travelers were too terrified to question a man with a badge and armed companions. Cooper, the wagon master, demanded to see proper documentation. Walsh shot him in the leg. The message was clear. Nobody interfered with Harrison Blackwood's business. Catherine ran. She abandoned everything except the clothes on her back and sprinted toward the tree line beyond the camp. Behind her, Walsh's men shouted and gave chase. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet. She zigzagged, trying to make herself a harder target, her heart exploding with terror. She reached the trees and plunged into the forest, branches whipping her face and arms. She could hear the men crashing through the undergrowth behind her. They were gaining ground. Walsh's voice called out, promising that if she surrendered now, Mr. Blackwood would be merciful. Catherine didn't believe him for a second. She burst out of the trees and found herself on a rocky slope leading down toward a river valley. Below, she could see the water rushing between steep banks. Behind her, the pursuit was getting closer. Catherine made a desperate decision. She started down the slope, half running and half sliding on the loose rocks. Her foot caught on a root. She tumbled forward, falling hard, rolling several yards before slamming into a boulder. Pain exploded through her shoulder and ribs. She tried to stand but her ankle gave out. Sprained or broken, she couldn't tell. Walsh's men appeared at the top of the slope. They saw her trapped below, injured and unable to run. One of them smiled. Walsh began making his way down carefully, his gun pointed at Catherine. "End of the line, Miss Monroe," he called out. "Time to go home." Then an arrow buried itself in the ground 6 inches from Walsh's boot. Everyone froze. Walsh looked up sharply. Along the ridge above them, 7 mounted warriors sat perfectly still on their horses. They were Lakota, and from their position, they commanded the entire slope. The warriors said nothing. They simply watched, arrows notched in their bows. Walsh understood the message immediately. These men had been observing the scene. They had witnessed Walsh's men attacking the wagon train, shooting an unarmed man, and now hunting a clearly injured woman. In Lakota territory, such behavior demanded a response. Walsh faced an impossible choice. He had been hired to retrieve Catherine, and she was right there, helpless and within reach. But he and his 5 men were exposed on an open slope, facing warriors who could kill them all within seconds. Walsh was cruel and greedy, but he wasn't stupid. He raised his hands slowly and backed away from Catherine. His men followed his lead, retreating up the slope. The Lakota warriors remained motionless, their bows ready. Walsh and his men reached their horses and rode back toward the wagon train, knowing they had lost this round. But Walsh's mind was already working. He would report back to Harrison. They would bring more men, perhaps soldiers. This wasn't over. Catherine lay against the boulder, pain radiating through her body. She watched Walsh's retreat with disbelief. Then she looked up at the Lakota warriors. One of them dismounted and began making his way down the slope toward her. He moved with fluid confidence, his moccasins finding purchase on the loose rock with practiced ease. Catherine's heart hammered. She had heard countless stories about native warriors, most of them designed to terrify white settlers. But she had no strength left to be afraid. If this man meant to kill her, there was nothing she could do about it. She closed her eyes, exhausted beyond measure, and waited for whatever would come next. The warrior reached her and knelt down. Catherine opened her eyes and found herself looking into a face marked by intelligence and strength. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with long black hair and dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. He spoke in Lakota, his voice deep and calm. Catherine shook her head, unable to understand. He tried again in broken English. "Hurt?" he asked, gesturing to her ankle. Catherine nodded. The warrior examined her injury with gentle hands, his touch careful and professional. He looked back up at his companions on the ridge and called out something in his own language. Then he looked back at Catherine. "Come," he said simply. "Not safe here." He helped her stand, supporting her weight. Catherine had no choice but to trust him. As the warrior guided her up the slope toward his waiting horse, Catherine realized that everything had changed again. The Lakota camp sat in a hidden valley where the grasslands met the foothills. Catherine had been there for 5 days, and every moment felt like existing in a dream. The warrior who had saved her was named Dakota, which she learned meant friend to everyone in his language. He had brought her to his people, explaining in his limited English that she would be safe there until she healed. The camp consisted of about 40 teepees, housing around 200 people. Children played along the river. Women worked on hides and gathered roots. Men returned from hunting with deer and elk. It was a community living as they had for generations, even as the white man's world closed in around them like a tightening noose. Dakota's mother, a woman named Winona, had taken charge of Catherine's care. She cleaned and dressed Catherine's wounds, bound her sprained ankle, and gave her buffalo robes to sleep on. Winona spoke no English, but her kindness needed no translation. She brought Catherine food and water. She showed her how to sit properly in the teepee. She smiled when Catherine fumbled with unfamiliar customs, patient with this strange white woman who had literally fallen into their lives. Other women in the camp were more suspicious. They had lost husbands and sons to white soldiers. They had seen their hunting grounds fenced off by settlers. They had watched the great buffalo herds dwindle year after year. Catherine couldn't blame them for their hostility. She represented the people destroying their world. But Dakota defended her presence. He told the Council of Elders what he had witnessed, white men with guns attacking an injured woman. By Lakota tradition, the strong protected the weak. Honor demanded they offer shelter to someone fleeing evil. The elders debated for hours before agreeing to let Catherine stay until she healed, but no longer. They understood that harboring a white woman could bring trouble. Soldiers might come searching. The camp couldn't risk drawing attention when tensions between the Lakota and the government were already dangerously high. Catherine understood she was living on borrowed time. As soon as she could walk properly, she would have to leave. During those 5 days, Catherine and Dakota spent many hours together. He was teaching her basic Lakota words while improving his English. She learned that Dakota had traveled more than most of his people. He had been sent east as a young man to a missionary school, where he learned English and white man's ways before returning to his tribe. He understood both cultures, which made him valuable as a translator and negotiator but also left him feeling caught between two worlds. He no longer fit completely into either life. When Catherine told him about her escape from Harrison, he understood immediately. "You run from men who own you like horse," he said. "Like how government tried to own Lakota land. Same hunger for power. Same emptiness inside." Catherine found herself drawn to Dakota in ways that confused and frightened her. She had been raised to believe native people were savages, less than human. But Dakota showed more humanity in his smallest gestures than Harrison had displayed in all the months she had known him. Dakota listened when she spoke. He asked about her thoughts and opinions. He treated her as an equal despite the vast differences in their backgrounds. When he looked at her, she didn't feel like property or a tool. She felt seen. Actually seen. It was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. On the 5th evening, Dakota brought Catherine to a hill overlooking the valley. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the camp below. Finally, Dakota spoke. "Tomorrow, your ankle's strong enough to travel. You must choose path. Stay with wagon train people if they still here. Or go different way. But cannot stay with Lakota. Too dangerous for you and for us." Catherine had known this moment was coming, but hearing the words still hurt. "Where can I go?" she asked quietly. "Everywhere I run, he follows. Harrison won't stop. Men like him never stop." Dakota was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. "There is place," he began carefully. "Far north. Trading post run by French man named Beaumont. He friend to Lakota. He not care about white man's law or rich man's money. You could work there, be safe. But journey is hard. 2 weeks on foot through territory where few white people go. Dangerous for woman alone." He paused, then added, "I could guide you. Show you safe path." Catherine turned to look at him. "Why would you do that? You barely know me. You've already saved my life once. You don't owe me anything more." Dakota met her eyes. "When I was boy at missionary school, other children beat me. Called me savage. Teachers punished me for speaking my language. One teacher was different. She kind. She protect me. She teach me English and treat me like human being. She say something I never forget. We survive by building bridges between different worlds. You and me, we both running from worlds that hurt us. Maybe we help each other find new one." The weight of his words hung in the air between them. Catherine realized he was offering her more than just guidance to a trading post. He was offering understanding, partnership, and perhaps something deeper that neither of them dared name yet. Before Catherine could respond, a young Lakota boy came running up the hill, calling urgently to Dakota. The boy pointed toward the eastern approach to the valley. Dakota stood quickly, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. Catherine struggled to her feet. From their vantage point, she could see what had alarmed the boy. Riders were approaching the camp. At least a dozen men, and leading them was a figure Catherine recognized even at a distance. Harrison Blackwood had come to claim his bride himself. The hunt was over. Harrison Blackwood rode at the front of his men like a general leading troops into battle. He had left his comfortable rail car behind and traveled the last 2 weeks through rough country, fueled by rage and wounded pride. Walsh and the remaining hired guns flanked him, along with 6 soldiers Harrison had convinced to join the pursuit by claiming Catherine had stolen valuable items from his estate. The soldiers represented federal authority, which meant the Lakota would think twice before interfering. Harrison had planned this carefully. Today, Catherine would be his, or she would die. Either outcome was acceptable at this point. He simply needed this humiliation to end. In the camp below, chaos erupted. Mothers grabbed their children. Warriors reached for weapons. The elders emerged from the council teepee, their faces grim. They had known this danger was coming. Dakota turned to Catherine, his decision already made. Go to my mother's teepee. Hide among the women. I will try to send them away with words instead of arrows. But Catherine shook her head. She had spent 6 weeks running, putting innocent people in danger. The wagon train had been attacked because of her. Cooper had been shot because of her. And now Harrison was bringing violence to people who had shown her nothing but kindness. She couldn't let anyone else suffer for her freedom. No more running, Catherine said firmly. This is my fight. Harrison came for me. I won't let your people die protecting a white woman they barely know. She started down the hill toward the approaching riders, limping on her injured ankle. Dakota caught her arm. He will hurt you. Take you back to cage you escaped from. Catherine looked into his eyes, and in that moment, something passed between them that required no words. Understanding. Trust. Connection. Then come with me, she said. Stand beside me. Not to fight, but as witness. Let Harrison see that I'm not alone. Let him see that some people in this world have honor. They walked together down to where Harrison's group had stopped at the edge of the camp. The soldiers looked nervous, surrounded by armed Lakota warriors who stood in defensive positions around the perimeter. Harrison dismounted, his expensive clothes covered in trail dust, his face harder than Catherine remembered. When he saw her emerge from the crowd, his eyes blazed with triumph. Catherine, he called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. Thank God. We've been so worried. You've been ill, confused. But you're safe now. We're taking you home. Catherine stepped forward, Dakota at her side. She spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, her voice steady despite her fear. I'm not confused, Harrison. I'm exactly where I choose to be. I left Philadelphia because I heard you laughing about 4 to 7 men who died in your mine. I heard you admit you bribed officials to hide your responsibility. I realized I was about to marry a man without conscience or soul. So I ran. And I'll keep running for the rest of my life before I become your wife. The soldiers exchanged glances. This wasn't what they had been told. Harrison's face flushed with anger. You're speaking nonsense. The stress of the wedding clearly affected your mind. These savages have filled your head with lies. He gestured to his men. Retrieve Miss Monroe. Use force if necessary. Walsh and 2 hired guns started forward. The Lakota warriors raised their bows. Tension crackled through the air like lightning about to strike. One wrong move and blood would spill on both sides. Then one of the soldiers, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, raised his hand. Mr. Blackwood, sir, with respect, she doesn't appear to be mentally disturbed. And she's clearly stating she doesn't want to return with you. We can't just take her by force without proper legal authority. Harrison turned on the soldier with fury. I have all the authority I need. Her father gave me guardianship rights. She belongs to me. The word belongs hung in the air. Even the other soldiers looked uncomfortable. Harrison had revealed his true nature with that one word. Catherine wasn't a person to him. She was property. Dakota stepped forward, his hand resting on Catherine's shoulder. He spoke in careful English, addressing the soldiers directly. In Lakota way, no person own another person. Man who think he own woman is man without honor. Man who send guns to take woman against her will is worse than thief. He is coward. Harrison's hand moved to the pistol at his belt. You savage bastard, how dare you? But the young soldier interrupted again. He's right though, isn't he, Mr. Blackwood? You keep talking about her like she's property you lost. Not a person who made a choice. The other soldiers were nodding now. They had traveled 2 weeks through hard country because Harrison told them a mentally ill woman had stolen from him. But standing before them was a clear-headed woman choosing her own path. The lie was obvious. Harrison saw his authority crumbling. In desperation, he drew his pistol and pointed it directly at Catherine. If I can't have you, no one will. The entire clearing erupted into motion. Lakota warriors surged forward. Soldiers shouted. Walsh reached for his own weapon. But Dakota moved faster than anyone. He threw himself in front of Catherine as Harrison fired. The bullet caught Dakota in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fell to the ground, blood spreading across his chest. Catherine dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against the wound. Around them, the soldiers had turned their weapons on Harrison, horrified by what they had just witnessed. Shooting an unarmed woman was beyond anything they would tolerate. Walsh and the hired guns, seeing the situation collapse, backed away slowly. They weren't being paid enough to face both armed soldiers and angry Lakota warriors. Harrison stood alone, his smoking pistol still raised, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. His plan had completely fallen apart. The young soldier disarmed Harrison and placed him under arrest. "You'll face charges for this," the soldier said firmly. "Attempted murder at minimum." As Harrison was dragged away, screaming threats and promises of revenge, Catherine focused entirely on Dakota. Winona and the other women came running with medicine and cloth. They worked quickly to stop the bleeding. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of Dakota's shoulder, missing bone and major vessels. He would survive. As Winona dressed the wound, Dakota looked up at Catherine with a pained smile. "You see," he whispered. "I told you. I would show you path to safety. Did not say I wouldn't get shot." 3 months later, Catherine stood on the porch of Beaumont's trading post, watching the sun set over the northern plains. The post was exactly as Dakota had described, a rough but welcoming place where Lakota, French trappers, and the occasional settler traded goods and news far from the reach of Eastern authority. Catherine worked in the store, managing accounts and helping Beaumont negotiate with the various tribes. She had discovered she had a talent for languages and had been learning Lakota from Dakota, whose shoulder had healed well. Harrison Blackwood had been charged with attempted murder, but his expensive lawyers had gotten the charges reduced. He served 3 months in prison before his political connections secured his release. But his reputation was destroyed. The scandal of a wealthy tycoon shooting a man while trying to force a woman into marriage had spread across Eastern newspapers. Questions about the mine collapse resurfaced. Investigations were opened. Harrison's empire began to crumble. The last Catherine heard, he was facing criminal charges in Colorado and had fled to Europe. She hoped she would never hear his name again. Dakota emerged from the trading post and stood beside her. His shoulder still bothered him in cold weather, but he never complained. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the darkening sky. Finally, Catherine spoke. "I never thanked you properly. For everything. For saving my life twice. For bringing me here. For giving me a chance to be free." Dakota smiled. In Lakota belief, when you save someone's life, your spirits become connected. We walk same path now. Where that path goes, we discover together. He held out his hand. Catherine took it, their fingers intertwining naturally. She had run from a man who saw her as property and found a man who saw her as an equal. She had fled civilization and found humanity on the frontier. She had lost everything she was supposed to want and gained everything she actually needed. As stars began appearing in the vast sky above, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not just for survival, but for a future built on her own choices. She was no longer a runaway bride. She was simply Catherine, free at last, walking her own path into whatever tomorrow would bring. And she would walk it beside someone who understood that true strength wasn't found in ownership or control, but in the courage to let others be free.